Mr. Ambassador, you were appointed ambassador to Argentina after a period of great difficulties in U.S.-Argentine relations. I'm wondering what your objectives and the objectives of the United States were when you assumed that post in Buenos Aires.
Well, our relations then with Argentina and with Mr. Perón especially were very bad at that point. Our former ambassador there had really gotten into a slanging match with Perón, and at the time of the elections was openly advocating his defeat. And of course this, as you might expect, angered Mr. Perón, so that our relations had declined to a very low level. And Perón was really trying to provoke us. They'd suppressed all but one of the newspapers, and just before I arrived, they took over La Prensa, which, as you know, was one of the great newspapers in Latin America. And so that made the situation even worse. Well, I decided there was no point in continuing this kind of slanging match. Adopted a different policy of correct aloofness. We never proposed anything. We never got involved in arguments. If they did any damage to us, we saw to it that we did one to them. And I think it began to have its effect. We call this a policy of masterful inaction. And the situation at least became tolerable, if not cordial, so that we got on a level of a better basis. Perón was at that time also promoting what he called the third force, which he claimed to be neither communism nor democracy, but Peronismo, and doing this in ways that he knew were provocative to us too, and to our policy generally. So I decided that the best thing to do was to ignore him. He didn't like to be ignored very much, but finally got used to it. And as I say, our relations did become then tolerable. On a personal basis, we got along reasonably well.
What were your impressions of him as a man?
He was quite a showman. No grasp of economic affairs at all. The country went from bad to worse with all its great resources and riches. But that's been true of its history right along. The Evita, in my view, was the stronger of the two characters. When Perón ever had some real tough jobs to do, he turned it over to Evita. And it's questionable in my mind whether he would have been president had it not been for Evita. You see, she was born out in the Pampas, as you know, and came to Buenos Aires to earn a living, and she got a job singing on the radio, only radio in the country, and of course long before television, and got a small salary. And she met Perón, who was a widower, and they became very friendly and took adjoining apartments, and she helped him. Perón then was Minister of Labor and acting Minister of War, and she helped him organize labor into one big union in the country. And he got so powerful, the rest of the junta got fearful of his power, arrested him, sent him off to the island of Martin Garcia in the Rio de la Plata, and then Evita organized demonstrations through the unions all over the country on his behalf. The junta got frightened at these demonstrations, brought him back again, put him up on the Casa Rosada again, and 6 months later he was elected president. Now, one interesting sidelight, when Evita Peron power increased and Evita's influence increased. Her salary went up and up. So she was getting a very large salary, but when Peron was arrested, she lost her job. But when Peron came back, she went to the owner of the radio, who was a Russian, said, "Now, Rusky, I'll take over the radio and you can go to work for me." And when I was there, he said, "Everything is fine. She lets me make plenty of money. I have no responsibilities."
Did you meet her personally?
Oh, yes, very often.
Do you have any personal recollections of her?
Yes, she is a very attractive person, and could harangue a crowd and hold 100,000 people there, you know. Not terribly good Spanish, but nevertheless, she could, and a great following among the campesinos. In spite of her luxury and her Paris dresses and her jewelry, which was never paid for, they thought, well, this is wonderful. She was one of us. This could happen to any of us. And I must say also, for Peron and Evita, they were the first, I think, the first people in government who had any great concern for the campesinos, the shirtless ones, and did a lot for them, and so did have a hold on them. But the country was, I say, with all its great resources, fared very badly economically. And after Evita died, Peron began to make mistakes, and the country got in so bad shape that was what finished him, until he came back some 17 years later.
How do you explain the paradox of a country as wealthy as Argentina having such a turbulent and unstable history?
It is strange, you know, neither the civilian government, Peron or the other civilians who followed him, nor the military government seemed able to have put together any national consensus. And here's a country potentially so rich. When I was there, and the Argentinians, well, you know pretty well too, I mean, they sort of looked down on the Brazilians and the rest of Latin America as being sort of, you know, the only white race there. And Brazil has surpassed them tremendously. I mean, we're way ahead of them, while they haven't hardly moved at all. There was an amusing story going around. I must say the Argentines have some sense of humor. Peron calling in his finance minister and saying, "We're really getting in desperate shape. We've got to do something." And the finance minister saying, "Well, Mr. President, we've done everything I can think of. And there's only one other suggestion I could make. I've run out of ideas except to go to war with the United States." Peron said, "What good would that do?" Well, he said, "Look at Germany, look at Japan, see what's happened to them. They've been at war with the United States. See all the money they're getting from the United States." Peron said, "Yes, but suppose we won."
That was actually one of the biggest issues in inter-American relations at the time. The feeling among Latin Americans that the United States was pouring a vast amount of money into Europe through the Marshall Plan, and that Latin America also deserved some kind of a Marshall Plan. What were your own feelings about that? And
well, I think we've always taken South America, Latin America, too much for granted. Haven't been a problem, so we haven't paid too much attention to them. I mean, we've turned our attention to other places where there seem to be crises or problems. And I regret to say, I think that we have never adequately developed our relations with Latin America to the point where I would like to see them. We do it spasmodically. Roosevelt with a good neighbor policy, but then World War II came along. We got absorbed naturally with all those problems. And then President Johnson again, now President Carter. But the Latin Americans, I think, feel with some justification there's been a lot of talk and not much action. On the other hand, they are too, many of the countries potentially very rich and have the means of developing, as Brazil has done and as Venezuela is doing and other countries. So that the potential is there. But again, I think too that in many of the countries, the oligarchy has ruled the country. In many instances, I think of some of the Central American countries, for example. Others have done very well for themselves, but not very much for the rest of the people. Now, this is true in the case, for example, of Panama, where Torrijos has been highly criticized as a communist and all. He's not a communist at all. But he's done more than any other ruler of Panama, head of government of Panama, to do something for the ordinary people of the country, for the farmers, the laborers. The oligarchy in Panama, many of them gotten very rich, but it hasn't filtered down through the country. And this is why he has a popular following in the country.
Critics would say, Mr. Ambassador, that the United States has partly been responsible for this support of the oligarchy, either through official governmental policy over the years or through the private business community. And since you were in private business in Latin America for so many years, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think the United States, as a matter of policy, does business with the government in power. I mean, whether they're a communist government or an oligarchy, whoever, we have to do that. We have to deal with the government in power. And where the government in power is friendly to us, we're naturally, our relations are friendly with them, and we do tend to support them. But I don't think that the businesses' interests have had the influence that some people ascribe to them in determining the form of government. I remember I was in the sugar business for many years, and I had interests not only in the United States, but in Mexico and Cuba and Puerto Rico, Colombia, and I got, my older brother and I, 1922 or 3, bought a controlling interest in a sugar property in southern Mexico. And I went down there to look at it, expecting to spend a couple of weeks. It took me 3 months to get out. I got caught in the last big revolution, Calles de la Huerta, you remember. And we did support Calles then as the government in power, although de la Huerta almost won out. But I got cut off there and couldn't get out of the country. So we had no, only way to get up to Mexico City was by rail from the Isthmus, and we went up, and then up the river from the plantation and got to the Santa Lucrecia to take the train, and the jefe of the town met us, said, "Sorry, there are no more trains running." We said, "What's happened?" He said, "The revolution started yesterday. And they've blown up all the bridges." But we said, "But the revolution wasn't supposed to start until next spring." This was November. He said, "Si, senor, but it started ahead of time." And so we had to go back and cut our communications. We had no way to get out. But I think our government simply took a position in support of the legitimate government. And wherever we can, I think we've tried to mediate between the disputing sides, as in the Dominican Republic. Later.
Perhaps we could turn to the Dominican Republic now then. It was a major event in inter-American relations in the last few years, and I guess there are few initiatives that have received as much criticism as the decision that President Johnson took to send in U.S. military troops in the Dominican Republic in 1965. I'm wondering what your assessment is in retrospect of that decision. You were then ambassador to the Organization of American States and then played a very leading role in mediating among the parties. Was it a wise move? Should we have invaded this Caribbean island then?
Well, that's the question. I've never formed any definite conclusions about it, really. Our ambassador there at the time reported that there was danger, he thought, to American lives, that this might result in a very active civil war, and particularly around Santo Domingo itself. And shooting came right close to the embassy, and he was fearful, too, of the communist influence there. And it was in response, I think, to his pleadings, in a sense, and his description of the situation, that the president decided to send in the Marines, which he did. Well, as soon as he did that, as you remember, the problem was put to the OAS, the Organization of American States, and we had very protracted debates going well into the early morning hours about the situation there, and did propose that we form an inter-American peace force, which required 2/3 support in the OAS, which we did get after some long night sessions, and did form an inter-American force with a Brazilian commander, 4-star general, General Alvim, as the commander. And the United States had the deputy commander's post, General Palmer, Bruce Palmer, who was a lieutenant general at the time. And the Paraguayans participated, the Panama, I think, and was it one of the other countries, Honduras, I guess. Yeah. And so established the force there and kept the force between the two sides and kept the fighting down. Whether I would say that the results would indicate that the intervention was not without merit, because it was possible then to reestablish a legitimate government by free elections, which were observed by the OAS, as you may recall. Not only by the OAS, but other organizations too, who were interested in the whole problem, whose report was very commendatory of the way the elections were carried out. And Balaguer was elected, and elected for 2 more terms. And now Antonio Guzman, whom I got to know very well, who was one of the negotiators on the Constitutionalista side, was elected president, and they had a peaceful transfer of power for the first time in the history of the country. And the Dominican Republic, after the elections of 64, 65, did prosper very, very greatly, and made great economic progress. And there's been a degree of stability there, which they hadn't had except under dictatorship before.
The critics have argued that the action of the United States undermined the Organization of American States, because the intervention into the Dominican Republic was done without consultation with the other members, in contravention of Articles 15 and 17 of the OAS Charter. And I'm wondering what your position was at the time. Were you consulted on whether the troops should be sent in? And did you think it was wise not to at least inform the other members of the intervention?
I was not consulted, no, the OAS was not consulted, but the decision was made very rapidly by the President, as President Johnson often did, act very quickly and very almost spontaneously. And I think that the reports that he got from our ambassador were so alarming to him that he made up his mind he had to act right away. And that if it got into a debate in the OAS that if American lives were in danger, I think it'd be in still greater danger and nobody there to protect them. And that therefore his first duty was to act on the advice of his ambassador on the basis that the information he was getting was correct and that there was danger to Americans there, and therefore acted quickly. But then we immediately, well, I say immediately, he didn't, the OAS, I think, was not informed the night they were sent in, but the next following morning. And then we immediately took up the question of an effort to try to bring the two sides together there, and did send a committee down quite promptly, who were not successful in bringing them together, and then moved to form this Inter-American Peace Force. And
do you think that in retrospect maybe it might have been wise to at least advise? Because if the principle of non-intervention is one of the cornerstones of
yes.
the charter, what is to prevent other states from taking unilateral action like that?
No, I think it might have been wiser to certainly inform the OAS first. I'm sorry we didn't do it, but I think the outcome would have been the same. I think the President felt that he had to act, that he couldn't wait for a long debate in the OAS where you would have to get a two-thirds vote on this. As a matter of fact, it took some time to get the two-thirds vote, to argue and debate the problem out in the OAS, and we finally did succeed in getting the vote.
One of the difficulties, as I recall, was that in order to get a two-thirds vote, you needed to have the Dominican Republic vote. And the Dominican Republic at the time had two governments, essentially, the constitutionalist government and the so-called loyalist government. And even for the creation of the Inter-American Peace Force, the vote of the Dominican Republic was crucial. How legitimate was it really to get the loyalist vote, particularly given the fact that the constitutionalist government had been elected or confirmed by the 1963 Congress, which was the only elected body, the only representative body, really, in the Dominican Republic at the time?
I don't remember how the votes finally fell, whether the Dominican vote was part of. Do you recollect that?
Apparently it was the key vote in order to attain the two-thirds majority because of the opposition of so many.
Well, if I remember, we had I'm not sure about that. It may be so. I don't know. But they were, of course, then the government which we recognized. We didn't recognize the constitutionalists, and we recognized them as a legitimate member of the OAS, entitled to a vote.
Now, I'm intrigued by your reference to Mr. Guzman because, as you pointed out, he's recently been elected now president, and you dealt very closely with him in the negotiations. Prior to your initiative through the OAS, there had been a U.S. Sponsored initiative in which McGeorge Bundy played an important role.
McGeorge Bundy
and Tom
Cyrus Vance.
And Cyrus Vance, yes.
Yeah.
And they had concluded an agreement with the constitucionalistas as well as the loyalists to a great extent, in which Guzman was to become the president And Guzman gave, apparently, assurances that he would not permit individuals that might be questionable in terms of U.S. interests to occupy important positions in the government. Why did the Guzman initiative under the Bundy proposal fail?
Because the Embert government didn't trust him, and refused eventually to go along with it.
Wasn't there some way, though, that the United States could have pressed Imbert? I mean, Imbert really was...
I don't know, but we didn't. I mean, the fact is that, that we had to go ahead with the negotiations in which I was involved because there was no agreement and no settlement.
That there was disagreement in Washington, too?
No, there wasn't disagreement in Washington. Disagreement was in the Dominican Republic. A settlement on the basis of the McBundy-Vance proposal didn't prosper, that's all.
And finally, then, on your general point that perhaps the initiative in historical retrospect worked because we've had a period of stability and progress in the Dominican Republic. If the Guzman initiative had prospered, don't you think that there might have been some possibility also of having a viable government in the Dominican Republic that might have had more legitimacy at the time?
I don't know. That's a matter of conjecture. Juan Bosch was a figure there that had to be contended with. As a matter of fact, I think most people were surprised. I saw a good deal of Bosch when I was there. I was surprised that and I think he himself was pretty confident that he was going to be elected. Surprised at the election, which was well supervised, and we think, and the OAS thought, very fair elections, that he didn't do so well. I don't know whether the situation would have prospered under the first effort or not. But the practical test, I think, was that it did prosper under the arrangement that we worked out. We were very fortunate, I think, when we as you remember, set up a provisional government under Hector Garcia Godoy, who was a very fine person, very able, very patriotic. Very tragic that he died when he did. But he also was very helpful, and had our strong support of the OAS.
The Constitutionalists complain that your commission was not interested in any of the names that they put forward, that in fact you had decided on Garcia Godoy early on, and that it was an unnegotiable...
We did decide on Garcia Godoy because we thought he would be most acceptable to both sides. He was the only person that we could find that had a possibility of being supported by both factions. The names that the Constitutionalistas first put to us were not acceptable in any sense to the Imbert government, but Garcia Godoy was neutral and was accepted, and fortunately so, I think.
He gave guarantees to both sides at the time of the negotiations, but later on, again, some critics have argued that he in fact did not keep some of the promises that he made to the Constitutionalists at the time, particularly with the matter of promotions within the armed forces and of maintaining some of the Constitutionalist officers within the government. And in fact, later on, there came a point where Constitutionalist officers were sent abroad, and the so-called Loyalists did not agree to go abroad as...
Not only no, we didn't send any Constitutionalists abroad. We did send General, who was the general on the other side, on the Imbert government abroad.
Wesson.
Wesson. Wesson, E. Wesson, yes, we shipped him out of the country because he was...
But aside from a few of the top people who were involved in the Imbert government, or supporting the Imbert government, the critics have said that many other constitutionalists never really achieved promotion. I don't know if you've seen any of that evidence.
No, I don't know whether that's true or not. I really don't know. I saw no evidence. I think Garcia Godoy, in my opinion, was very even-handed. And I think it was very fortunate that we had a man of his caliber and character and attainments as provisional president. I think he did an outstanding job. So it's great credit.
I might shift again to another issue dealing with Latin America. And this has to do with something that you were not involved in at all directly, but I would like your opinion on it. A few years later, after it had been concluded that, in many circles, that the United States would not intervene in the way that it intervened in the Dominican Republic again, there was a covert intervention in the Chilean case, in which the President Nixon and Secretary of State Kissinger, I guess then National Security Advisor Kissinger, supported a coup to prevent the accession to power of Salvador Allende in Chile. I'm wondering what your feeling is about a situation in which, through a popular election, which no one questions the legitimacy of the election, a government comes to power that is not of the liking of the United States. Should we tolerate that kind of government, or should we take initiatives not to allow that kind of government?
I think we have to accept the vote of the country. I think we have to. I remember when I was going to Vietnam and I was questioned by the Senate Finance Committee, and Senator Fulbright, the chairman, asked me, said, well, now, Mr. Bunker, suppose, and I told him that our objective was to have free elections and a free self-determination by the Vietnamese people of their own future. He said, well, suppose they had a vote and they voted for a communist government. Would we accept that? I said, yes. If that's a free vote, the Vietnamese people, we would. That's their business. And I don't think that we should undermine or attempt to undermine the free will of people of a country.
Even if it might affect, because Henry Kissinger's argument was that it would have a very deleterious effect on our European allies, because it would encourage the Italian communists and the French communists to form alliances very similar to the Chilean ones. And his argument was, and I think the quote was textually, the United States cannot stand by idly because of the irresponsibility of a people with electing some nefarious government, as he thought of it.
I don't know that, and I don't recollect that myself, but it does seem to me that it's pretty difficult for us to play God and decide that if someone is elected, it may be harmful. May be, but I think that it's been our principle of our policy that's run through our policy as a thread for 200 years, the right of self-determination. And I think that's a policy that has been generally followed by the United States. There may have been exceptions, and there may have been, we did, of course, intervene quite widely in Latin America for many years because we felt that situations there were out of control, but we've since pulled away from that policy.
Do you feel that covert action on the part of the United States government is a necessary element of our policy?
I don't. Yes, I think where you're faced with a situation such as we do, as we face ourselves now with the Russians who are supporting political parties all over the world, that covertly, that we have to engage in covert action too. I think any country's Secret Service on occasion has to resort to covert action, and I think I'm sorry to see the CIA come under such criticism. I think that the Russians, the British, the French, who have their own secret services and effective ones, must be wondering what we're up to, trying to destroy our own secret service, our own intelligence service. And I've just been in India, where I've been informed that the Russians were spending large amounts of money among the Indian political parties. This is the sort of thing that that goes on, and those are some of the facts of life.
Why can't we support democratic parties openly without doing it covertly? The social democratic parties in Europe supported the social democratic parties in Spain and in Portugal openly, and yet, for example, in the Chilean case, we had to support the Christian Democrats covertly, and it's actually done them great damage in retrospect to have received that covert support. Why can't we just put our cards on the table and say, let's just support them democratically?
Because we think that it will hurt them probably more than help them, saying, oh, you're getting help from a foreign power. That may be quite true. It gives the opposition opportunity.
Mr. Ambassador, you've recently taken a leading role in another very fundamental issue affecting U.S. foreign policy, which was the difficult process of negotiating a treaty with the Republic of Panama, and then subsequently helping to gain support for that treaty in the United States for the necessary Senate ratification. I'm wondering if you could give us your views on that process, and did you find it more difficult actually to negotiate the treaty with the Panamanians, or more difficult to sell the treaty to the American people?
Well, it was a long negotiation, of course. The problem started in 1964, although it had been building up before that, but started with the riots and fighting there in '64, when some 4 people were killed and nearly 400 wounded. And I was then in the ambassador of the OAS, and Panama broke relations with us, as you recall. And we tried to get the situation back to the point where we could resume relations and try to get negotiations started. I think was referred to the Peace Committee in the OAS, and we had, I don't know how many resolutions, none of which were acceptable to one side or the other. And I finally got the Panamanian ambassador off by himself, away from the press and everybody else, and we worked out an agreement that let us renew relations with Panama, and then agreed that we would negotiate a new treaty.
Which was the 8-point plan, is that?
No, this was long before that. This was in 1964. But President Johnson then announced that we would begin negotiations for a new treaty, which would have a termination date, unlike the old treaty. Well, negotiations started then, and Robert Anderson, who had been Secretary of the Treasury, was appointed chief negotiator, and he kept on negotiating until, from then on, 65, I guess he took over, till 1973, when he resigned. And then when I came back from Vietnam, the president asked me to take it on. So I did take it on then in November '73, and kept on with it till we got through with the Senate. The 8-point guidelines were the first thing that I negotiated with the Panamanians 8 principles to provide guidelines for negotiation. And Kissinger went to Panama and signed those agreements with the Panamanian foreign minister in February '74. And then negotiations started in earnest on the implementation of the guidelines. They continued. In '76, little was done because of the political campaign in the United States. And then Ambassador Ellsworth joined me in January '77 and continued the negotiations, which we finally wound up in September. So it was a long process, a long negotiation of 14 years nearly.
What were the most difficult elements involved in your negotiations with the Panamanians?
Well, the most important thing to them was the question of continuity, perpetuity rather than continuity. What was most distasteful to the Panamanians was the fact that the whole treaty had no termination date. It gave us these rights forever. And so the most difficult, and actually the most difficult problem, I think, that we had to deal with was the question of the preservation of the permanent neutrality of the canal, because it has elements of perpetuity in it. So that proved to be a very difficult problem to work out. That's why we had 2 treaties, and one on the operation of the canal, one on the protection and neutrality of the canal. It made it all the more difficult in the Senate because we had to get a 2/3 debate on 2 treaties rather than 1. So it did make it very difficult.
What was it like negotiating with President Torrijos?
We didn't negotiate with President Torrijos. They had a negotiating team who reported to him directly, headed up by the foreign minister, and the foreign ministers changed during the course of the negotiations.
He took a very active hand in it, though, didn't he?
Oh, yes. They reported to him very frequently, constantly, and he made the final decisions. But we had 3 foreign ministers during the course of the negotiation. And finally, in the last few weeks, they appointed a head of the delegation, other than the foreign minister.
You repeatedly said in many of the speeches that you made in support of the treaties, in order to muster senatorial support, that this was a vital issue, that if the treaties were not approved, Panama had the makings of another Vietnam. I wonder if you could elaborate on that. In what sense?
I never used that language. No, I think Secretary Kissinger did perhaps once. I didn't. But I did say that I thought the canal was not defensible within Panama. If the canal were attacked from outside, it would have to be defended outside Panama. But as it runs through 50 miles of jungle, impenetrable jungle, there's no way it could be protected from sabotage or terrorist acts. And being a locked canal can be put out of action quite easily. And this is the position of our military, that what they were interested in was the use of the canal, not its ownership. They wanted to see conditions that would make it possible to continue to use the canal, and they couldn't see that it would be possible if we couldn't do it on a mutual friendly basis.
Some argue that the treaty should have had a provision that called in writing for a permanent right for the U.S. to defend the canal. And there's some controversy because the White House at one point put out a memorandum which suggested that language would be in the canal. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering what your reaction is to
No,
that.
we have the right permanently to defend the canal against a threat to its operation. And we had an exchange of letters with Torrijos to that effect. That is, agreeing that the language of the Treaty on Neutrality gives the right of either country to act to protect the operation of the canal. It doesn't have to be joint if the canal is threatened. Now, there was some criticism of that by some people on the ground that, or some interpretation, the Senate attempt to interpret it as giving us the right to intervene anywhere in Panama. That's not what the language says. And that's not what the exchange of letters said. We can act to protect the operation of the canal. But that doesn't mean that we can intervene in Panama to upset their government or affect their political situation, anything like that. But we can take what actions necessary to defend the canal itself.
Let me move to some more general questions dealing with Latin America, perhaps one broad one to start with. Are you optimistic, having observed Latin America and U.S. Latin American relations for a good part of this century? Are you optimistic with the trends that you see, or pessimistic? Do you see improvement, or do you think that we haven't gotten very far?
No, I think there's improvement, yes, over the century, surely. I mean, there's no question in my mind anymore that we would ever embark again on the interventionist policies that we had prior to, say, before the 1930s, the early part of the century. I think we've gotten, that's long past. And I'm optimistic. I think the situation is spotty. I think there's some places that have moved quite rapidly. Brazil is now a powerful country, and it's going to be a more powerful country. It's got, what, 110, 15 million people already, population. Mexico has its problems, but it's got now apparently enormously rich in oil. And the question is how they'll be able to distribute that wealth, and whether the farmers, again, the agricultural sector of the country will benefit from it. Venezuela is enormously rich in oil. And in Chile, you have great resources in Chile. And so do many of the countries. Argentina, which has really never taken advantage of what they have. No, I'm optimistic that they'll continue to make progress, and I hope that we'll pay more attention to South America than we have sometimes in the past. I say because we haven't had any troubles there, that we've sort of taken it for granted. And I think that's been resented. In fact, I'm sure it has, but I suppose I'm a little prejudiced because I have 4 Brazilian grandchildren. So I have pretty close ties to South America.
Do you see any negative aspects about what has proven to be a trend towards increasing authoritarianism in Latin America after a period of some optimism about democracy? You've, in a sense, spoken about the economic development of Latin America. What about in political terms? Is there some prospect for a return to more democratic governments in Latin America?
I hope so. It's very hard. It's hard to say. The situation, I say, is spotty. It's not clear. There is a good deal of authoritarian rule, of course, but it varies in degree. In Brazil, I would say it's a pretty lenient authoritarianism. In fact, I had, when I was in Saigon, when a young Brazilian doctor came out to volunteer work there in the hospital in Saigon and stayed with me for 10 days. And he said to me once, "Mr. Ambassador, we do not have a democracy in Brazil, but we have a very good government." And, and I think that's one of the things that people are interested in, good government, efficient government, more so than in the form in many cases. And there are, I think, indications now that the Brazilian government is beginning to ease up on restrictions and moving more and more toward a democratic process. And I think, I haven't kept very close of late to other countries because I've been so involved in the Panama thing that I haven't attempted to, but I have the impression that the government in Chile is moving more in that direction. Perhaps also in Ecuador and Peru. I don't know. You know better than I about the situations there.
Do you think it's wise for the United States to press some of these governments to improve their record on human rights in the way that this administration has done?
Well, I think we should have an interest in human rights everywhere. Again, I think it's a question of how you do it and how you go about it. And I think going about it in a punitive way, and that is penalizing countries, is questionable. And I think it can be overdone, but I think we still should keep it in mind as an element, a cardinal element in our philosophy of government, and in our relations with other countries. Well, I mean, here Nicaragua is the most recent example where we've taken a position on the question of human rights in the form of government and the way the government operates in Nicaragua. And we've done our best to try to bring about some solution which will improve that situation. I'm sorry to say that our proposal wasn't accepted by President Somoza, but I think it was a constructive one.
And finally, what policy recommendations would you have for a new administration coming in dealing with Latin America? What do you think the United States should be doing in the next few years in Latin America?
Oh, I think it's very difficult to generalize. The problems in each country are so different. Generally, but I would say that what I said in the beginning, I hope that we would pay more attention to Latin America than we have in the past, because I think in view of what's going on in other places in the world, let's take the Arab situation, for example, and the oil situation, the Arab situation. We will probably need more help from Mexico, from Venezuela, from the Latin countries that are oil producers too. They'll have obviously the same interest in price as the Arabs, but they are our friends and they're near at hand, and I think that we ought to. That's just one element, and many others where I think we should try to develop closer relations and show more interest. We're going to need, the world is so interdependent today, we're going to need help from you and you're going to need help from us. It's got to be mutual. And I think we're becoming increasingly aware of that. Therefore, I'm hopeful that our relations with Latin America will become closer.
Thank you very much.